of the world's largest democracies are drawing closer. This is the second edition of the India Development Debate this evening. I'm Supriya Srinath. India and the United States today signed a deal on defense cooperation, paving the way for sale of sensitive American military equipment to India. The breakthrough came following negotiations between U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj and Defense Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. The high-level meeting, touted as the 2+2 talks as it involves two top Indian ministers and two high-ranking U.S. officials, is seen as a move to counterbalance China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean region as well as Pakistan in Southeast Asia. The Communications, Compatibility and Securities Agreement, or COMCASA, had been stalled for years because of New Delhi's concerns that it could open up communications network to the US forces. The 2+2 talks, the paradigm shift in the military ties between Washington and New Delhi, is a big topic of discussion and debate. I couldn't have asked for a more well-informed topic with the far-reaching perspective that they have. Dr. Kamal Sibbal, former diplomat and former foreign secretary. I've also got Rajat Nag, distinguished fellow NCAR, and of course Sushant Sareen, strategic affairs analyst. Thanks each one of you for joining us. Mr. Sibbal, if I may begin with you, sir, how important is the 2+2 dialogue in the scheme of things? Now, given the geopolitical situation, which is in a state of flux, and will this really put India at the same bracket as some of US's traditional allies, a UK, a France, a Germany, and even a Saudi Arabia for that matter?
No, not really, and I don't think we want to be put in that situation either. We don't want to be the allies of the United States. We want to have an alliance of interests with the United States, and that is how it should be, because India will lose all its strategic autonomy and its capacity for taking independent decisions if it actually became a member of an alliance. You can see the relations between Europe and the United States, and Japan and the United States, how utterly dependent they are on the United States for their security. I think the 2+2 dialogue has a different purpose, which is to consolidate the strategic understandings between India and the United States and send a signal right down to the bureaucracies and other political decision makers that at the highest level in the United States and in India, there is a desire to deepen the strategic partnership, because on many issues there is now convergence, though of course on many other very vital issues there is as yet not sufficient convergence, and this 2+2 dialogue is a building block for expanding our convergence on issues of bilateral interest, and those are and regional interests, and those are very clear. One, of course, is peace and security in Asia, the rise of China, the threats in the Indian Ocean, terrorism, Afghanistan, etc., etc. And these are the issues on which United States and India can build a productive relationship. That's one aspect. The other is that it is unusual for any country to have the defense and foreign ministers joining together to have a dialogue. In other words, build a convergence between defense and foreign affairs. Actually, in our own country, we've not been able to build sufficient convergence between the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of External Affairs. So I hope these kind of 2+2 dialogues will help us to achieve that. I think it's a very powerful political signal to the region that India and United States are now finding common ground for working together, and the signals that will send to China and Pakistan, because these are the two immediate neighbors, and these are the two countries which are huge headaches both for India and United States. I will touch upon those topics in just a minute, sir. And the signal will go to them that...
no, absolutely. I will touch upon the topic in just a minute, sir, but I want to get across Sushant Sareen also to contribute to this dialogue. The 2+2 talks were initially scheduled for April, were postponed after the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was replaced by Mr. Pompeo. It was rescheduled for 6 July in Washington, again delayed because he had to make a trip to North Korea. U.S. Embassy, of course, did try and explain that, but do you think, Sushant Sareen, that America doesn't accord India the special importance that perhaps we enjoyed under the Bush and then, of course, in the Obama administration?
Look, clearly, I think Mr. Trump has a completely different style of diplomacy, as we have seen. But I think on India, at least so far, we have seen, him being far more expansive than he has been with some of his other older allies. And to that extent, I think that is something we need to welcome. And welcome also because even with somebody like Donald Trump, the India-US relationship is going from strength to strength. And I think what has happened today, especially the signing of the Comcasa agreement, I think that really catapults the strategic partnership which we keep talking about with the US to the next level. While I have my differences with the term strategic autonomy, I understand the spirit with which Mr. Sibal is espousing that concept. But the fact of the matter remains that until and unless we are self-sufficient, we are self-dependent for most of the defense equipment on our own resources, strategic autonomy is a bit of a fiction. And I think the sooner we realize that, the better it is, because the kind of challenges which we are going to be confronting in the coming years, not just from China, but also on our western borders. We have Russia. We don't know which direction the Russians are leaning. The Russians haven't been very sensitive to our concerns vis-a-vis Pakistan, or for that matter, Afghanistan. Iranians have been shifty all along. You have the Middle East, which is in a flux. So clearly, we need a strong partner. And if the US becomes that strong partner, we must keep in mind the fact that, that old saying that it's not good to be enemies of the US, but it's even more dangerous to be friends of the US. We must keep that in mind. But I think within those parameters, we need to push ahead with this relationship.
Okay, I think both you and Kawan Sibal at least share the point that it's good to be close to the US. Let's not get too cozy with them. But Rajat Nag, let's really talk about the big substantial issues. And, these talks were held under the backdrop of the recent tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, America's objection to India buying missile defense systems from Russia, and USA's stringent H-1B visa rules that impact Indian IT companies. I've got specific questions on those topics, but has the recent tension and point of divergence dragged the Indo-US relationship down, or do you believe we are pretty much where we were?
Supriya, I'm glad you raised that point. I agree fully with what Mr. Sibal was saying about the importance and the usefulness of a 2+2. But let me expand the discussion to include the point you raised, and that is really what happens to the issues under the so-called CATSA. This is that concept of my enemy's friend is my enemy, so that when the US pulled out of the nuclear deal with Iran, and India continues to import from Iran, oil from Iran, India is vulnerable to coming under sanctions. Our financial system can be very severely disrupted. Now, I think that is a very major issue, which perhaps was discussed, but certainly not very openly, because India has very serious, long, historic and strategic relationship with Iran, and economic reasons to deal with Iran, import oil from Iran, the Chabahar port that we are developing in Iran, which links up with Central Asia. So I think there are these issues which are very important, notwithstanding the 2+2 dialogue. I think the third leg of this stool really should have been and must be exactly the issues that you're talking about. The Trump administration has taken a very mercantilist, short-sighted, narrow view by imposing tariffs. Where do we fit into the picture? So I think the situation is certainly better with a 2+2 dialogue than without it, but I have very serious concerns about economic issues, the H-1B issues that you have talked about, the trade issues which are obviously in the horizon, relationship with the US vis-a-vis Iran or Russia. So these need to be discussed and discussed very openly.
Okay, of course it needs to be discussed openly, and which is why I'm going to take it across to Mr. Sibal, because the External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj did tell Parliament in last monsoon session that India will raise the issue of changes in H-1B visa humbly, is what she said at 2+2 dialogue, which happened today. Yet in the joint statement, there is no mention of the visa issue, and even the Trump administration officials had told the media that there has been no change to the processing, though the executive order has called for a broad review. In the broad parameter of the whole gamut of discussion, and since it was the first to have taken place, how disappointed are you that this really wasn't taken up? Because this is going to have far-reaching ramifications. I mean, if everybody who's applied for a permanent residency, they will have to wait for 151 years according to the K2 Foundation. H-1B may affect more than 1 million Indians living in the United States. Can we just not raise these issues? Are you disappointed, Mr. Sibal?
Well, firstly, Sushma Swaraj in her joint press conference said that she had raised the H-1B issue and wanted a more sympathetic understanding from the United States on dealing with this issue. I think she's right in raising this issue for the reasons you have mentioned, because the United States is hectoring us and in fact arm twisting us on a whole lot of trade issues, and this cannot be a one-sided affair where they can demand that we sign on what they are asking for, and on our side we desist from raising the issues which concern us. But having said that, I think the United Nations administration and Trump and other members of the administration have made it clear that H-1B is a politically sensitive issue for them for right or wrong reasons, and they are not going to yield on this issue, and I don't expect therefore much to happen here. We are trying to lobby with the big media companies of California and other companies which use highly qualified, highly skilled Indian personnel. There may be some understanding reached in a limited way on these visas, but what had happened earlier is not going to be repeated, and we are going to face this difficulty with the United States, and we should not hold out too much hope of finding a solution that actually meets our needs.
No, I agree with you. So, Shansari, let me just turn focus to the other part of what has happened today. The two sides have signed the Communications Compatibility and Securities Agreement, the COMCASA, that will facilitate access to advanced defense systems and enable India to optimally utilize its existing US origin platforms. Now, in the past, the US hasn't been very keen to part with this kind of transfer of technology to India. India has also had its own, objections and has its own apprehensions to this. They feared endangering its operational autonomy of sorts. What has then led to this change of heart? I mean, India's decision to buy 114 fighter jets worth $20 billion, Boeing and Lockheed Martin eyeing it. I mean, why have the two sides have had a change of heart suddenly?
Well, I think both sides were realizing, and if you spoke to the Americans, I think it was very clear from their perspective that, this constant stalling of these, what the Americans call the foundational agreements, was going to limit how far the Americans could go with India. And if we wanted to take this relationship, at least the strategic level of the relationship, more so in the Indo-Pacific to the next level, then, the Americans required that we enter into some of these agreements. So I think that via media has been found. That is one. But I think there was also, and probably many people will not like it, a bit and a nudge and a shove and a push from the American side to the Indians that, look, if you want to move ahead, please go ahead and sign these agreements. The other part of it is that even from our point of view, as the Americans say that, look, you buy a computer, but if that computer is not connected to a network, then it's a dumb terminal. Which is what most of the equipment which we were buying from the Americans was, because we were not connected with the rest of the networking which comes with that equipment, which we now will get access to. So to that extent, I think it works very much in our favor, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, perhaps also in other parts of this region, the CENTCOM area and the rest. So I think there was a kind of a convergence of interest, but also a bit of arm twisting, a bit of a nudge and a push, which led India to finally agree. Also, I think, and that is important, that some of the, apprehensions which we had about signing some of these agreements, I think that has also gone out. There were these irrational fears that the Americans are going to start listening to all our communications and the rest of it. That paranoia also, I think, has gone to some extent. And to that extent, I think it's good that we have finally shown a level of confidence by going ahead and signing these agreements.
Fair point. Fair point. I think it's also a maturity in conversations and a maturity in deliberations is also a sign of that. But Professor Nag, if I may ask you, do we really stand to gain by signing the COMCASA? I mean, you know, our total imports from the US account for only 14% of our total arm imports. We can't use COMCASA on our Russian and indigenous platforms. You know, does the signing of this really lead US access to, you know, the paranoia that we have? I mean, how do we really stand to gain given how small our import from US really is as far as our arms and weaponry is concerned, our defense equipment is concerned?
I think that is where the balancing act comes in. I fully agree with Mr. Sareen that, you know, we have to act big if you're going to be big. If we're going to be on the global stage, we can't always take a very narrow view and be paranoid about it. You're absolutely correct. I mean, we've got to look at our other big supplier, our major supplier, Russia, and we've got to make sure that the systems are consistent. But I think it is appropriate for India as a rising power, particularly in Asia, to take a view that we can deal with more than one sort of, you know, major partner. And India and US is going to be the second largest supplier of arms to us. I think we've got to play that game strategically, and I don't think we should take the approach that we will not deal with them just because it's only, you know, 14% or 15% of our requirement. I think this is a right move, but we've got to go into it with very open eyes. I like what Mr. Sibal said right at the beginning, that we don't want to be part of any alliance. It's only a question of what is in our best interest, and I think the COMCASA is something which is in our interest, so long as we balance it and keep a very strategic view over it.
I want to go back to Mr. Sibal, but I will take a quick follow-up with you, Professor Nag, because the joint statement reads that both sides committed to further expanding and balancing the trade and economic partnership, including improving market access. Given Trump's anti-globalization stance and the raising of tariff barriers, is this one sore point between the two countries that may upend the bilateral relations, or can India and US actually agree to disagree on this one issue, so to say?
You know, the reason I'm smiling is, the honest answer is who knows. If there's one thing that's predictable about Mr. Trump is that he's very unpredictable. So principle-wise, yes. India's overall trade with US is just about $125 billion. I mean, that's the total imports of goods and services. It's fairly small compared to US's overall trade of about $4 trillion, much smaller than China's. So I think there is a huge potential for increased trade with the US. I was very pleased to hear the Commerce Minister saying that, you know, we should aim at a $500 to $600 billion trade volume. I think that's doable, and therefore mutual access, mutual understanding of each other's constraint. We talked about H-1B visa, and yes, of course, India benefits from that. But so does the US. I mean, we are providing some very high-powered intellectual services of our young people, particularly in the IT industry, which is very much needed by the US Silicon Valley. So, quite honestly, Supriya, I don't know the answer because, you know, Mr. Trump may change his mind. But it does look like he's taking a reasonably consistent view about the relationship, economic relationship, and perhaps other relationship with India. And I think the bottom line is that the US needs India just as much, of course, without a doubt, India needs the US.
Mr. Sibal, obvious follow-up to this has to be that US wants a commitment from India to cut down importing oil from Iran. The joint statement is silent on this aspect. How are you going to read into this? Is this vexed issue going to be discussed privately? Will there be a battle of rhetoric, public posturing? I mean, how are we going to get about this issue? Because the reality is that given the present situation and given the amount of oil that we import, we get it at very cheap rates from Iran. It works to our advantage. Anything more expensive is only going to add to our CAD and to our deficits.
Well, you know, the two issues that have not been addressed publicly are our defense relations with Russia and the possible imposition of sanctions because of CATSA and the procurement of oil from Iran. Now, on both these issues, the United States, to my mind, is completely in the wrong. This is just bullying tactics that they are engaging in, because they have walked out unreasonably from the nuclear deal with Iran, and has posed immense problems even for Europe and their other allies who are seething. I can tell you, I was in France a few days ago, who are seething and are feeling helpless because of the extraterritorial application of US laws, and the fact that their companies, despite the government volition, are not willing to go forward with their projects in Iran for fear of US sanctions. Now, in our case, they expect us to reduce our oil offtake from Iran to zero by November 4 or November 6. This is simply not possible. Now, there may be some agreement with them about phasing out and reducing our oil supplies from Iran. Iran may accept this because they may understand what our compulsion is. To this extent, it is somewhat doable, but to reduce it to zero is not only out of the question, but we should not actually bend to America's pressure on this. Otherwise, we will damage our relationship with Iran for a long time to come. And there are equities that we have in Iran which United States may not have, but we need to preserve, whether it's energy or transit or Central Asia or Afghanistan or the Shia-Sunni conflict that is raging in that region. With regard to Qatar, I think the United States is following a very self-defeating course, because if they want to step up their defense relationship with India and want to sell India more weaponry, then they cannot start imposing sanctions on India because of our relations with Russia. Then how do we trust them? Fortunately, we've walked out of this whole business of sanctions with the United States after our nuclear deal, and we'll be coming back into this stage of sanctions once more. And you mentioned earlier F-16s and F-18s or whatever. On what basis do we buy these if tomorrow again, for some other reason, on some other issue, we are faced with this problem of sanctions? So I think there are people like General Mattis and the US defense companies who see the dangers down the road, but unfortunately the American administration under Trump is following a particular course of action, and I explain why. Because Trump does not attach importance to geostrategic issues, to strategic issues, as much as to purely trade issues, because he feels that American concentration on these issues in the past has weakened America, and he wants to strengthen America economically, and hence his demand that countries must reduce their deficit with the United States. There has to be a balance from our point of view between our strategic relationship with the United States and trade relations. And if the United States is not willing to accept the balance, then I'm afraid this 2+2 or anything else will move forward, but will not reach the kind of results that both sides might want to actually achieve.
Okay, I'm going to request. I'm going to just request both of you to be brief, because I've got two quick last closing questions. Running short on time here. Sushant Sareen, the dialogue also called on Pakistan to bring justice expeditiously to perpetrators of Mumbai, Pathankot, Uri. Sushma Swaraj says terrorism emanating from Pakistan was discussed. We have been discussing this issue for decades now. Does US see reason in our allegations? Trump administration may have cut aid to Pakistan, but are they supporting our demand at all?
Supriya, two things. One on your question, and one after this. I'll just like to join issue. Not often I do that with Mr. Sibal. On your question, I think the Americans have done a fair amount as far as terrorism is concerned and our concerns on terrorism is concerned, given the fact that they also have interest in Pakistan, Afghanistan. They have supply routes running from Pakistan into Afghanistan, and a whole lot of other issues which are involved in their case. But despite that, whether it is sharing of information on terrorist acts, whether it is on sanctioning terrorists, whether it is on putting pressure on Pakistan, whether it is naming Pakistan for all the acts that they've done, I think the US has done far more than any other country on the issue of terrorism, which is directed also against India. On the other issue of what Mr. Sibal was saying, I agree there needs to be a balance, but there also needs to be a balance between geostrategy and geoeconomics on our part. As Mr. Nag was saying, we have what, $125 billion of trade with the Americans. What is our trade with the Iranians? About $14 billion, out of which about $10 to $12 billion is oil which we buy from the Iranians. What is our relationship with the Russians? Yes, there is a strategic level of relationship, but that's been cooling off, and the Russians haven't really been playing, what should I call, they haven't been playing the honest broker in some ways as far as India is concerned, as India's strategic concerns are concerned. And then on the issue of terrorism, the Russian, flirtation with the Taliban, with the Pakistanis, I think these are matters of very serious concern to us. Now, when we start stacking up our relationship, for example, with Iran, with our relationship with the Americans, I don't see how it stacks up, because with the Americans also come the Europeans and some of the Arab countries, with which we do tenfold the business which we do with the Iranians. So geostrategy and geoeconomics needs to be balanced, and we need to strike that balance on our own accord as well.
Okay, so Shant. Okay, so Shan Sareen, I'm going to quickly take a last question to Mr. Sibbal. And Mr. Sibbal, I'm sure all of us are aware, all of us have read that New York Times op-ed which has been written by one of Trump's own men. He says Trump's impulses are anti-democratic, he's anti-trade. He goes on to talk about the president's preferences for dictators, and well, even talks of whispers within the cabinet to start the process of removing the president. How seriously at this stage should we be engaging with the US administration then? Because does it make sense for us to lie low, wait out his time period?
No. So long as Trump is president of the United States, we have to deal with him. We should deal with him. We have to deal with this administration. We cannot start speculating on how the internal political process in the United States will go, and base our policy on that. That will be a very foolish thing to do. There are so many things that are happening between us and United States which go beyond relations between the two governments. And therefore that relationship, the large relationship, has to be nurtured, has to be expanded in every possible way. We know that there is a huge move within the United States, the intelligence agencies, the mainstream press, and the Democratic Party and think tanks against President Trump's way of doing diplomacy, as also some of the internal decisions he has taken, and of course the whole issue of Russia and whether Russia helped him to gain power, etc., etc. So let them fight their internal political battles, just as our two parties, BJP and Congress, are fighting their internal political battles. And United States would be equally foolish if they thought that for the next elections in 2019, we don't know what's going to happen. So let's slow down in our relations with BJP.
On that note,
that will be a very silly thing for them to do also.
Sure. Mr. Sibbal, I've completely run out of time here. I've been told by my director and my producer I really need to wrap. But thank you very, very much, Mr. Sibbal, Mr. Nag, and of course, Mr. Sushant Sareen for being with us. This has been a fascinating discussion. 2+2, important for India and US to talk. It's important to be comfortable with the US. Getting too cozy may work to a disadvantage. But thanks very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate.